Cool. So everyone, thanks for sticking around. So we're here to talk about decentralized identity, the tricky problem of who to trust. I think sometimes when people talk about I work on decentralized identity, it's kind of as broad as like I work on DAOs or as I work on NFTs or I work on DeFi. And it's good to always narrow down to hear about the use cases that are the most prescient in the space and what's going on. I think one of the first things that is at the core of decentralized identity is when people say not your keys, not your crypto, it also translates quite well to not your keys, not your identifier, or not your identity. And from that, you could build the basis of identity with your keys alone and add context based on situations. And I want to kind of get kicked off first with a couple of introductions, talking about specifically what got you into decentralized identity and what you're working on today. And get started with you, Danny.
Sure. Hey all, thanks for sticking around. Danny Zuckerman, one of the founders of $3 Labs. We've been working on decentralized identity and data for 3.5 years now. Actually further going back to Uport with some folks like Reuven here in the audience. I got into the space and identity in particular because I was co-authoring a book about identity completely outside of the tech space. And in that kind of psychological and sociological exploration of identity, one of the things that comes out really strongly is we think of identity as this singular, static, individual thing, but identity is much more dynamic, much more social, and much more plural. That's a much better conception of identity. And decentralizing the architecture of the web gives us a chance to actually remake the way that we manage identities and think about it in data in that model instead of the much more rigid model we've had today. And so what we've been working on at 3 Labs recently is Ceramic Network, which is a sovereign data network that gives applications a way to build really rich applications with really dynamic data features in really powerful ways that are completely sovereign to users and really flexible to those use cases, but don't lock people into any one model or into any silo. So yeah, Ceramic Network is what we're working on now.
Hi, everybody. My name is Brad Cam, co-founder at Unstoppable Domains. And the way that I wound up in decentralized identity, I actually didn't realize that that's what I was doing initially. I thought, so Unstoppable Domains builds domains that are NFTs. The first use case was to mask your crypto addresses, to be able to point your crypto addresses to a human-readable name, similar to like a decentralized Venmo. And we founded the company in January of 2018, started with this crypto payment use case, realized as we were moving along that these are actually decentralized identifiers. Your Venmo account, your Venmo handle is an identifier as well, and realized that there's just going to be many different use cases for it because the domain name is really just simply a decentralized identifier, an NFT that you store inside of your wallet. And then what we've been building on top has been essentially a standard, a way to tie information to the domain, and it can be really all kinds of information, extremely broad. So we thought we were getting into crypto payments specifically, and realized that it's actually a universal decentralized identity for the internet. And I almost kind of hate the term identity for it because I think that people think of, first of all, they think of scary things, like people are going to know exactly who I am. And a lot of people would like to be pseudo-anonymous in the crypto world. And so maybe identifier would be a slightly more accurate term for it.
Trying to get away from KYC on the blockchain as the immediate knee-jerk response.
Hey, I'm brantly.eth. I don't know why that's in quotes on the screen. I don't know who Brantley Milligan is. So I'm Director of Operations at Ethereum Name Service. And yeah, similar thing. So ENS launched 2017. It was intended to be .eth names for Ethereum addresses and then also for Swarm hashes at that time. Swarm was a thing. That was the initial impetus. But it's grown a huge amount since then. So there are two types of names on ENS. There's .eth names, which are native to ENS. We also allow people to import in names from DNS. You can have like bcmilligan.com on ENS. So those are the two types of names. The three use cases, the number one is identity. So it's ENS is your portable cross-platform username and profile. This works in tons of a lot of the top Web3 services already. So like Uniswap, OpenSea, like if you log in there, it just defaults to your ENS name as your username. Snapshot, CryptoVoxels, Avagachi, tons of places. Actually, right before I got on, I saw on Twitter that Uniswap just added this functionality to their Sybil governance website as well. So that, I think, is extremely powerful. Of course, we also do payments for all cryptocurrencies. So you can send Dogecoin to bcmilligan.com, and it's using ENS on Ethereum in the background. I think that's also extremely powerful. And then decentralized websites. And I actually view all of these as part of the same thing. So there's this phrase out there that innovation is bundling or unbundling. So it's like your username, your identity, your payment information, and your website used to be all different. Well, ENS puts it all together. And yeah, I think that's extremely powerful.
And that's one of the things I want to get into is context. So at the root of all this is you have a user with a public key. And obviously, there's not much context behind that public key. Someone can remain anonymous, which is totally fine. But they're able to operate as that public key. Now, when you add additional context to that public key to identify who this is, for example, Brantly as brantly.eth, you add additional kind of power to this identifier or this identity. I'd love to get into some of the use cases that we've seen kind of emerging in the space when it comes to adding context to an identity. So for NFTs, this could be like, how do you prevent copy minting fraud? For DAOs, this could be if someone's specialized to do something. How do you add just enough context to that identifier to say this person is capable of doing this thing, or this person is who they say they are? I'd love to get started again from this side.
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch that I'll let them talk about around user reputation and name and some of the stuff that we think about as identity. I'll go to something that maybe we don't think about as quickly, which is all of the content that we generate online. I think that's just as important information and context about an identifier as anything else. I'll use the example of Twitter. If you think about the Twitter experience in Web 2, there's so many different pieces to identity there. Right? You log in, password, that's your equivalent of your key in Web 3, your authentication. Then you have your username, which again, I'll let them talk about because they work on that much more. You might have your basic profile, the stuff that you put in your bio. And maybe you have a verification, the check mark. And maybe we know who Naval is, right? That username has a lot associated to it. He's built up a reputation there. Maybe some celebrities or well-known people have that blue check mark. Nobody knows who Dezuck is. I'm Dezuck. I'm not going to have a blue check mark anytime soon. But you can go to Twitter and get a pretty good sense of who I am by looking at all of my tweets and the things that I've engaged with. And if we think about Web3, most of the content that drives our experiences and that people actually interact with us based on is not these things that we usually think of as the profile. It's all of our posts, our participation in governments, all this content that has made up the social web. And so I actually think the starting point for identity in Web3 is how do we manage all of this massive amount of data in really flexible ways and attach that to different types of keys and usernames in a flexible way.
So maybe I could create two buckets here. I think there's, and I'll give examples for both. There's on-chain data and off-chain data associated with your username, your decentralized username. And so an example of what we did on the on-chain data side, we have these NFT art galleries. And so I have brad.crypto. You can go and check out an Opera browser, a Brave browser right now, and you can see my NFT art collection. And the way that the template works for the website is you need to be the owner of the domain name and the owner of the art for it to display. And if you were to sell something and it would leave your wallet, then it'll disappear from your collection. And if you were to buy something, it'll appear. So essentially what you have there is you have a verified website. There's all of this on-chain data that can be associated with your username, and it can be, I'm a whale on Uniswap. It could be, I'm a part of these 10 DAOs. All of this stuff if you have the username, if you have the name, you can now associate the history and kind of build this on-chain reputation. But most data is not on-chain, so there's this huge other pool of data that you can also get access to. And so an example of that, we built a feature using Chainlink oracles that allow you to tie your Twitter handle to your domain name. And the way that this works and the way this gets used in practice is you can go and type in somebody's name in order to send them money, and then you can see the Twitter handle before you send. And this is much closer to the way an identity would work in the Web 2 world. If I were to go send somebody money on Venmo, I'd probably see your picture. Maybe I'll see a link to a social media account about you. I'll be able to verify some information to make sure that I'm sending to the right person. And the name on its own might not be able to get you there. So there's all of this off-chain data too that you're going to be able to attach to your domain. So those are probably the two biggest categories, and a couple of examples.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. So our philosophy is, so the core part of ENS is always going to live on Ethereum, especially the root zone. But we're getting ready to come out with a system called Durin, which will allow people to store data anywhere that they want, so that you can always store data on layer 1 if you want, Ethereum layer 1 if you want. But you could also store it on a layer 2, on another layer 1, on a server somewhere. So we think that's the best approach to give users total choice on storing their data, their addresses, any of their avatar stuff, anywhere that they want. So there's that. And then in terms of this making connections with other things, Frame, which is a cool project, just came out with a browser extension that connects with ENS. So a very common thing is people put their .eth name on Twitter, if you've seen that before. So what they will do is they can actually, if you put your Twitter handle in your ENS records, it'll verify that there's that connection there, and then also display information about your Ethereum account based on that, which I think is really cool. But sure.
Yeah, and Brad, I know you mentioned the concept of reputation, and I think that's going to come up more and more as apps continue to scale and continue to gain a lot of traction. More people come in, knowing who can do what and why. I'd like to actually talk about the topic of reputation, and I definitely want to ask whether you think it's going to be someone determining a reputation system that gets widely adopted, or kind of multiple forms of reputation systems that someone kind of takes off the shelf, because in the case of reputation, it's going to be different for different contextual situations. So that's one thing I wanted to ask you additionally on that.
Yeah, I think the starting point needs to be that the user is in control of their identity and the user owns it completely. That's the starting. That's the sort of the basic idea for all of this. And then if that's true, then the user can choose what information they tie to their identity. And the way I think that this is going to go is it's sort of bottom up because of that. So the user can say, here's this piece of information that I'm going to attest or associate with my identity, and here's this other piece. And then the collection of all of these things is what makes me online, is what gives me my reputation. And so I think it's extremely unlikely you're going to have the equivalent of like a single credit score in the Web 3 world, because, well, first of all, the credit score in the Web 2 world does a terrible job representing how you are financially. It's taking a very small slice of your history. So I think that is a very unlikely state for us to end up in, and that we're going to wind up with a lot of different types of reputation scores, reputation proofs, things like that. And I think it's going to be extremely broad and maybe even somewhat chaotic for a while. But I'm sure there will also be kind of leading forms of reputation that wind up getting popular and getting recognized. Because ultimately, what you need is the user to be able to decide what they want to share and what they want to prove and what they want to attest. And then you need apps to be able to use that information to provide some service that they couldn't previously provide. So if you just look out there in the ecosystem, there do tend to be apps that win. So I would suspect that there's going to be a handful of reputation systems that might get very popular, but I would be very surprised if it were one, and actually I hope it won't be one.
That's what I'd say, Brandly or Danny, if you have additional thoughts, I'd love to hear them too on reputation.
Degen score. That's the new
one of the greatest apps I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree. I think this reputation systems are basically algorithms on top of data. So the starting point, as Brad said, is lots of data aggregated around the user in their control to share or not share, depending on the context. Then I think there'll be lots of reputation algorithms. You can think of that as almost a service layer. So the best credit scoring services or others will exist as a service. And then, reputation as we see them on applications are just those algorithms deployed to build trust in a context in that application or in that protocol. So you've got data, you've got reputation algorithms, and then applications will have to choose the right services and algorithms and data sets on which to build trust in their specific context, but definitely no universal reputation. I think reputation is always contextual.
And I think this also brings up a very interesting point, and that's as we start adding reputation, as we start adding credentials to these users and starting to build these identities, a lot of it is very public. And as kind of stewards on the identity side, I think one of the most important things, one of the biggest criticisms is privacy when it comes to a lot of these systems, that we're not only tying financial information with users who use their wallets very actively in terms of their holdings and how they're trading, but also now tying identifying traits to those wallets, making sure users are safe in different ways. I think one of the burning questions and one of the largest criticisms is how do we protect the user privacy in these kind of new forms of decentralized identity, especially as they are key-based, and which also translates, let's say, in the Ethereum ecosystem to wallets. And let's get started.
Yeah, so I think we can start on, let's talk about the context of things that can be pseudonymous, so things where you don't actually have to attach a real-world legal identity. So reputation is a way to turn applications from one-time games into repeated games. It's a way to build trust and enable things to happen over time with some familiarity. Doing that requires some knowledge of the counterparties. It doesn't have to be, again, legal identity, but there has to be that context that you can bring to bear and depend on. If you're trying to build things that are not pure machine-to-machine protocols too, you're relying on some human behavior. And human behavior becomes much more pro-social, much more collaborative when reputations are at stake. And that requires things being done in public, not in private. That's been true forever, not just on tech. So I think that we need to build systems that can preserve user privacy, that always make it very, very clear to users when they are doxing themselves, when they are leaking metadata, when they are potentially sharing data, explicitly or implicitly that might reveal something that they don't want about themselves. But we can't actually build really rich social experiences in a purely private, one-time way.
Yeah, I think there's multiple use cases here. There's a privacy use case, there's a pseudo-anonymous use case, and there's a public use case. And I imagine that many people in this room would probably want potentially all three, depending on what the specific user behavior is. I think this is already happening with social media companies where you have your public handle and it's tied to your public identity, and then you have something else that's not. And you also have this even with social media companies in the context of having different types of reputation being divided out. So you've got your professional identity over here, and you've got your friend and social identity over here, and then maybe you got your dating social identity over here. So these things are already segmented. And so I think you're going to have a lot of different use cases, and then you're going to have a lot of different needs depending upon what that use is. But I'm also pretty bullish on people being able to store data themselves or be able to provide proofs of data without actually having to share the data itself, and then that's going to be a really strong privacy preserving mechanism. I might be able to go through some sort of identity check or something like that, and be able to come out the other side and say, I've been checked, I'm American, or I'm not American, or whatever, but I don't want to tell you who I am, and I don't want to tell you where I'm from. So I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to get to a place where we're going to be able to share proofs of the information without actually having to share it.
Yeah, this is all true. So I'd say privacy is a problem with blockchains in general, and it's a very difficult problem to solve. It's one that's been talked about since even before Ethereum existed. I mean, even in the Bitcoin community, people were talking about privacy and the need for privacy things. So it's something that's been around a long time. There's been some major strides made, with zero-knowledge proof technology, which is an insane breakthrough in mathematics that I can't believe exists, which that's incredible. So for the time being, what I highly recommend to people is have multiple, let's say cryptocurrency accounts or Ethereum accounts, have a public account that you're you're okay showing with people, and then have at least one or maybe multiple private accounts, and try to keep them separate at least a little bit. I mean, I think that's just basic good security practice. I mean, that has both privacy benefits but also security benefits. And then, I think the future may be some combination of zero knowledge proofs or things like this. But I think it's a very difficult problem to solve, and it's going to take, likely, in my opinion, a good amount of time of many different attempts at this made and kind of letting the market provide feedback before something gets going. But I do expect that to happen eventually.
Yeah, and I think one of the most important things brought up too is the idea of, enabling, allowing users to see what they're consenting to. Is that we are aware we're operating in public. Maybe when you flip the switch, you've gone from private to public, and putting whatever barriers in place that don't necessarily impede users on a platform, but rather just let them know what's happening, I think is one of the strongest things that can happen right now. And what's also kind of an interesting emerging trend is anonymous teams too, where you kind of have someone who's literally kind of operating as a public key or anonymously or pseudonymously and being part of teams building great software in the space. Like the sushi team, for example, having a lot of anonymous contributors is showing how powerful it is that you could basically retain your identity in a way, operate as this key, and still make a meaningful contribution to the space. One of the additional things I want to talk about too is kind of the other side of it, where one of the greatest goals for all of us is let's get more, users using keys. And I think that was one of the greatest things that blockchains did, is that we now have this thing that's put public-private key pairs in the hands of millions and millions of people, which all this is based on. One of the kind of closing questions I want to ask is, on the other side with newcomers to the space, and especially in the context of identity, what do you think are kind of going to be the emerging ways where we get more keys in the hands of newcomers? Is it going to be a trend like NFTs, for example, bringing people who have never heard of public-private key pairs, getting them there, and then kind of working with identity? Or kind of how do you see this emerging, especially with brand newcomers to the space? I think it's already in this line.
So I love that there are so many more wallet options now, which really do the work of managing keys, and they each make different trade-offs. I think that we saw a year ago there were a lot of apps that were trying to abstract the crypto away from users as a way to onboard mainstream users. But it's once you do have a key in the user's hands, it's so much more powerful. It's so much more seamless to be able to just authenticate in and be able to do everything off that, to be able to have composability of not just your assets, but also more and more your data, and bring that with you across experiences. But let users choose and applications choose. Do they use Magic and passwordless login? Do they use Taurus? Do they use MetaMask and push users that way? What's really important, though, as we have this proliferation of different keys on different blockchains in different wallets, is you don't want to fragment all of these experiences by key. Then we're in a way worse situation from a UX perspective than Web 2, and we know how bad passwords are there. And so we need a way to tie all these different keys to a unified identifier that is more resilient than a single key, because we all have multiple keys and rotate away from them, that is more persistent, and that can aggregate these to deliver a good experience across chains, across apps. That's what the DID spec that was created at the Decentralized Identity Foundation, now W3C does. And so using these primitives that are really thoughtful about decentralized identity and how that's going to enable not just great, you're in the app and you can do some basic things, but actually a full experience. As we have different types of keys and more users coming in, I think that's a key point to build in.
So I think the most important thing is that the user always has choice. But I'm going to throw out a controversial view here, which is that I do think that a lot of newcomers in the space will potentially use custody solutions more than they are today. And my evidence for this is the fact that most people who store or own large amounts of crypto store it on exchanges rather than inside of self-custody wallets. So that tells me that where we are broadly in the NFT custody space is we're much earlier than we are with ERC20 tokens and with tokens of layer 1 blockchains. And I don't think that the current custodial model that exists today is ideal for customers either. I think there's going to be some new custodial models that are going to leave the user in control, but give them better backup options, essentially. And you're already starting to see some of this. You see like wallets like blockchain.com where you can, encrypt and back up your key on, iCloud or whatever. I can't remember what service they use. So there already are some very early models. And the reason I bring up blockchain.com is because their mission very specifically is to onboard new users into crypto. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that than we do today. I think that as long as I think the number of people who are storing their own keys is also going to go up, 10x or 100x or whatever. But there's going to be this big pool of users that are going to want more custodial options that don't exist today. So controversial view, lay it on me.
It's okay, we can have both. I don't know if you were referencing a Twitter thread I had earlier this year about this or not, but I have similar thoughts about this, talking about Rocco. So I don't think identity is like enough by itself to necessarily get people to get private keys and things like this. I mean, maybe it will be a motivating factor for some people. I'd say like that was the mistake of like the cypherpunks in the 90s. So public-private key cryptography has been around a long time. It's not new with the cryptocurrency or anything like this. In the 90s, it became legal in the United States. This is a long story short. And that hey, everyone should have a private key. But it was like for moral reasons, like privacy and liberty, which I believe in, but just doesn't motivate most people. Or at least not enough to like go out and do it. And what cryptocurrency did is it created a financial incentive to do it. It's like, well, that speaks to a lot more people. And so one of the great happy side effects of cryptocurrency is we're giving people private keys. And then, oh, great, we can use it for things like identity, for encrypted messaging, for signing things, for provenance. And of course, NFTs is reaching a whole nother group of people. They don't care about cryptocurrency, they don't care about money, but they do care about art, or they care about culture. That's bringing in new people. So that's my mental model, is that even like with ENS, the initial killer use case was, it simplifies crypto payments, and that was really motivating for people. Then, we can also use it for identity. So will we see identity itself motivating people? Maybe. But I've generally seen it as something that kind of comes along with other things that are more motivating.
Yeah, it's kind of like, hey kid, you want some dog money? You're going to need a public-private key pair for that.
Exactly.
And all of a sudden it's like, whoa, now we got money in the wallet. And I think one of the things also that's really going to be the factor to get over this is you have no more forgot password button, especially when it comes to public-private key pairs, and I don't expect my grandmother to memorize her private key or put it in a bank vault somewhere. But with that, we are out of time, and do appreciate having you all, and thanks for coming in and learning about decentralized identity.
Thanks, Greg.